It is always a pleasure and an honor to share Aunt Harriet Tubman's story and give commentary on her political activism. This year, women across this country are rightfully celebrating the centennial anniversary of the 19th Amendment. On August 18, 1920, Congress ratified the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, granting women the right to vote. Women's right to vote was clearly hard won. The movement started about 100 years prior to the passage of the 19th Amendment. In this centennial anniversary year, we acknowledge that thousands of women who fought the good fight were no longer able to see the fruits of their labor, the fruits of their resistance, and the fruits of their political activism. Most of these women will remain nameless and their stories will remain untold. A good friend and historian, Sally Roche Wagner, reminds us that we typically think that history is what happened. History is not what happened. History is who tells the story. So, on August 18th, 1920, 100 years ago, Congress ratified the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, giving women the right to vote. Yet, Black women would still encounter many barriers when attempting to exercise that right. In fact, it wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, for which tens of thousands of African Americans worked tirelessly over the decades, that Black women were able to exercise their right to vote. We stand on the shoulders of many Black suffragists, including Mary Ann Chad Carey, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Mary Church Terrell, Nanny Burroughs, Daisy Elizabeth Adams Lampkin, Ida B. Wells, Fannie Lou Hamer, Mary McLeod Bethune, and Harriet Tubman. These women pushed for voting rights. Today, I want to introduce you to Harriet Tubman, the woman, the liberator, the humanitarian, patriot, and strong supporter of universal suffrage. I will begin by introducing myself. My name is Michele Jones Galvin, and I am a great-grandniece of Harriet Tubman. My 3 times great-grandmother was Sophia Ross, Harriet's sister. I am a 4 times great-granddaughter of Henrietta Green and Ben Ross. They were the parents of Harriet Tubman. And I am a 5 times great-granddaughter of Modesty, Harriet's grandmother. Now, I know that that's a mouthful, but I am so proud to share with you my biological ties to Harriet Tubman, greatest conductor of the Underground Railroad. This story begins with my mother's passion to find her biological connection to Harriet Tubman. My mother, Joyce Stokes Jones, learned that she was related to Harriet Tubman as a young girl growing up in Auburn, New York in the 1930s. As an adult, she realized that her grandparents, her parents, aunts, and uncles actually knew Harriet Tubman, known as the Moses of her people. Interviewing her relatives was not enough. My mother wanted to know more. She wanted to know exactly how she was related to Harriet Tubman. She needed to know whether her great-grandmother, Anne Marie Ross Stewart Elliott, was a sister or a niece of Harriet Tubman. My mother's research took her as far south as Maryland and as far north as St. Catharines, Canada. She met with descendants of former slave masters. She would leave no stone unturned until she was satisfied that she was able to create a tapestry of the lives of the Green Ross, Tubman, Stewart, Gaskin, Stokes lineage. She knew it would reveal a story that was never told before. Now, while she set out to document her findings for her children and their children, she later thought that others might want to know what she found. Thus, the makings of a book was born. Our book, Beyond the Underground and Harriet, Moses of Her People, begins with the remembrances of a young black girl who frequented the Booker T. Washington Community Center in Auburn, New York. This book discloses a new discovery about Harriet's nephew-in-law, Thomas Eliot, who was also a renowned escaped slave. It also reveals that Harriet Tubman's grandmother, Modesty, was a slave on the eastern shore of Maryland who gave birth to the daughter of a white man. The daughter, named Henrietta Green, would become the mother of Harriet Tubman. Our book answers the long-sought question about Anne Marie Ross Stewart Eliot, but you're going to have to buy the book in order to see what that's all about. It uncovers the life, times, challenges, and triumphs of Harriet Tubman, greatest conductor of the Underground Railroad. Ours is a story of 7 generations of women of African descent tied to the bloodline of Harriet Tubman. Harriet herself is showcased as an ordinary woman who does extraordinary things. Harriet was a loving person, but she was rejected by the love of her life. She feared no man or woman, but was obedient to her Maker. She was brilliant, but unable to read or write. She owned property, but was not allowed to vote. She was compassionate, but did not take kindly to foolishness. Harriet's service to others was a testament to her values and commitment to faith, family, fortitude, and freedom. So for the first time, descendants of Harriet Tubman tell the story of the famed abolitionist within the context of our family lineage. This book is an intricate mix of family lore, memoir, and historical construction. It captures the lives of the family and friends of the greatest conductor of the Underground Railroad in a way that separates it from academic works. This book lures you into having a more personal relationship with Aunt Harriet. It depicts a family from which an American heroine is born. A family that survives slavery, one that gains freedom and begins the journey of creating a new life beyond the shackles of human bondage. This book is our tribute to Aunt Harriet and to all of those who came before us and upon whose shoulders our freedom was won. Today, we focus on resistance and liberation by unleashing the power of activism within the context of American slavery and women's suffrage. Specifically, we celebrate Harriet Ross Tubman, whose life and work was a great testament to resistance, liberation, and activism. Aunt Harriet was born into freedom. She survived the inhumanity of it, and she summoned the courage to escape it. Aunt Harriet risked life and limb. She resisted the law by rescuing scores of slaves. She liberated men, women, and children, bringing them out of the land of bondage to the land of freedom. We memorialize Aunt Harriet and other women who made a significant imprint on the history of this country by transforming the lives of individuals, families, and communities. Women like these come to mind: Frances Miller Seward, Lucretia Mott, Jane Addams Hull, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, Dorothy Height, Alice Paul, Barbara Jordan, Eliza Wiggum, Emily Howland, Nanny Burroughs, Bella Abzug, Lucy Stone, Coretta Scott King, Lizette Miller Warden, Kate Shepard, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Peace Nichol, Fannie Lou Hamer, Shirley Chisholm, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Ida B. Wells, Gloria Steinem, Sojourner Truth, Rosa Parks, Mary McLeod Bethune, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, Mary Church Terrell, and of course, Harriet Ross Tubman. Now, it bears mentioning here that we should also acknowledge the multitude of unsung sheroes of the anti-slavery movement, the women's rights movement, and the civil rights movement, whose names and toils have long been forgotten. The challenges and triumphs associated with their lives and their causes brought liberty, justice, equality, education, and community services to men, women, and children across this country. But let us not stop there. Each and every one of us can look back into our own lives and picture the face of a woman who made an indelible mark on our lives. She was grandmother, mother, aunt, sister, daughter, friend, neighbor, mentor, doctor, minister, or teacher. Each in her own way, leaving an imprint of her values, her strength, and her hopes for the future and all of its possibilities. A professor of mine once said that African people believe as long as one is remembered, his or her spirit lives. In our family, the spirit of Harriet Tubman lives. She was a slave who decided she had the right to two things, liberty or death, and she was bound to have one of them. She rescued hundreds of slaves and delivered them to free land. She served her country during the Civil War and was known as General Tubman. She lent her expertise as a spy, scout, and nurse. Through it all, she was simply Aunt Harriet. I am reminded of what another professor of mine once said. You can only understand the motivation, the work, and the values of a person by understanding the historical era in which she lived. We often need to be reminded of the historical era in which Aunt Harriet lived. With the passage of time and the promise of progress, we tend to blur the reality of that historical period. Harriet, like most slaves, was acutely aware of her station in life. For close to 250 years, people of African blood were forced to perform backbreaking work from sunup to sundown, harvesting tobacco, cotton, rice, and sugar. The enslaved were treated no better than farm animals. They lived in squalor. They were not paid 1 red cent for their work. They had nothing to show for their labor. Prior to the Civil War, there were close to 4 million enslaved Africans in the South. Slavery in America was known as the Peculiar Institution. It was established and regulated by law. For nearly 250 years, slavery was fueled by what I call the quadruple oppression of white supremacy, racism, sexism, and classism. Slavery was an economic institution of human chattel enslavement, comprised primarily of Africans and African Americans. Slaves were forbidden to hold property, forbidden to leave the plantation without permission, forbidden to be outside of slave quarters after dark, forbidden to carry firearms, not able to learn to read or write, or to legally marry or divorce. They could not vote. They were forbidden to testify in court or to congregate with other slaves except on the fields or at church. They could be sold away from their families at a moment's notice, never, ever, ever to see them again. In fact, New Year's Day was not the day of celebration that we now enjoy. There was no clinking of glasses of champagne at midnight and singing Auld Lang Syne. Oh no, on New Year's Day, slave families huddled together in fear and trepidation. It was a day that planters would sell or lease slaves in order to settle their debts. It was a day of debt abatement. For slaves, it was a day of separation. Slaves never knew who in the family would be sold or leased that day to a faraway plantation never to be seen again. Would they snatch one child, all of the children, the mother, the father, or both? It was a day of trauma with a capital T. It also was a day of deceit and deception. More times than not, slaves were led to believe that their family members were being sold to faraway places like Alabama, Georgia, or Mississippi. The slaves were terrified by the stories they heard through the grapevine about the more savage nature of slavery in these states. In fact, unbeknownst to them, many of their loved ones were sold or leased to farms right in the same vicinity or county. Their loved ones were figuratively in their own backyard. Imagine they were right down the road, never, ever to be seen again. The female slaves were of great value. When the importing of slaves were banned in this country, slave traders and plantation owners established what they called breeding farms. African male slaves were brought to the farms for the sole purpose of impregnating female slaves. Bags were put over their heads, and this would be done so that the male could not see whether the woman was his mother, sister, aunt, or other relation. This practice was widely used to supply the number of slaves needed to maintain and sustain the slavery system. Female slaves were also greatly valued as domestic slaves. They were often brought into the home to cook, clean, launder, and breastfeed for white mistresses. Many mistresses found breastfeeding to be demeaning and uncultured. So, once a slave gave birth to a child, she was often assigned to the mistress and forced to breastfeed the white child instead of her own. As a result, many black children died. Reluctant slaves were beaten and forced to breastfeed anyway. Many female slaves were also physically and sexually abused by their masters or overseers. The mixed-race children, or mulattoes, were evidence in plain sight, primarily because of their skin and hair texture. A person born with a hint of African blood was presumed to be a slave unless it could be proven otherwise. And that is not to mention the lashings, the beatings, branding, and the brutality for the slightest perceived transgressions. Even in death, the deceased were buried in the dead of night so that the mourners would not disrupt the workday schedule with such activity. And candles were used to carry the body to its final resting place. The day-to-day rigors and the day-to-day torments and the trauma of slavery were unquestionably inhumane. The question remains, were these conditions sustained for that long? I would argue that the peculiar institution of American slavery was, in fact, a clear, compelling, and classic example of the power of intersectionality. American slavery demonstrated the power of the interlocking ideological, cultural, and economic effects of white supremacy, racism, sexism, and classism on African slaves and their descendants. I would also argue that the binding of these variables and their effects were and are still manifest in the social, political, and economic fabric of American society, and that is from 1619 to present. The vestiges of the peculiar institution of American slavery persist today. They permeate the major sectors of society, including but not limited to faith communities, education, employment, health, housing, law enforcement, legislation, and public policy. Oh yes, Aunt Harriet knew the backstory of slavery and its effects all too well. Harriet, whose birth name was Araminta, was called Minty. She was born in 1821 and raised on the Brodus plantation in Bucktown, Maryland. She was one of 9 children born to Henrietta Green and Benjamin Ross. The master, Edward Brodus, was described by Harriet as a wicked man. As a child, Harriet was leased out to other plantations to monitor muskrat traps, to weave fabric, and to care for infants. On one plantation, she was severely beaten for tasting a lump of sugar. On another, she was fiercely beaten because she could not keep a crying baby quiet. The screeching and the wailing prevented the mother from being able to sleep. As a teenager, she suffered a brutal injury that almost killed her. She bore the scars of a 2-pound iron weight crushed against her head by an overseer. I believe this incident was Harriet's first undertaking of activism. She refused to help the overseer to subdue a runaway slave. The overseer was stunned and angered by Harriet's belligerence. He looked for the first thing he could put his hands on. He spied a 2-pound iron weight. He lifted the piece and swiftly smashed it against her forehead. Blood splattered everywhere. Harriet fell to her knees and lay in a heap on the blood-stained floor. Over a number of weeks, Harriet's parents nursed her back to health with herbal medicines that they had gathered from the woodlands. The injury caused her to appear developmentally delayed or slow at times. She suffered from what today we would call narcolepsy, an involuntary lapse into sleeping. It has been referred to as sleeping seizures. Master Brodus called her sickly, and he said she was damaged and could not be sold for much. No, Harriet no longer wanted to be bound to this way of life. So at the crossroads of slavery and liberation, Harriet was haunted by the idea of escaping. It lurked heavily in the back of her mind. If she decided to escape, she knew the dangers. She could be caught and returned to her master, beaten to near death, or lose an ear, foot, or hand. At the end of the day, Harriet was determined to have freedom or death. She knew what she was willing to die for. It was time. It was time to escape. Her husband, John Tubman, a free man, refused to flee with her. Under the threat of being sold to a faraway plantation like we talked about to Alabama, Georgia, or Mississippi, Harriet made her way north. She made her way north by day, following the moss growing on the north side of trees. By night, she followed the North Star. In 1849, through woodlands, fields, and swamps, Harriet escaped to Pennsylvania, which was free territory. This would become the second time she would unleash her individual power of activism. She escaped from the eastern shore of Maryland to gain her freedom from the brutal system of bondage. She resisted the status quo. She resisted the cruel and inhuman system of slavery, and she claimed her right to freedom. Mission accomplished. She claimed freedom in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Harriet lived there as a free woman, and she became very acquainted with the work of the anti-slavery movement. It was there that she became a champion, advocate, and vital part of the anti-slavery movement and the workings of the Underground Railroad. It was there that Aunt Harriet became an abolitionist, humanitarian, and freedom fighter. Today, as we focus on unleashing the power of activism, what better example of political awareness and political activism than Harriet Tubman? Unleashing her power of activism, she began her rescue missions with the emancipation of her family. Returning to the South, some refer to it as the old neighborhood, she secretly attempted to rescue her husband. Well, she was shaken by the realization that he had remarried. But deciding not to be deterred from her mission, she took out 11 passengers. And a few years later, she absconded with her 3 brothers and 3 other slaves. Shortly thereafter, she descended again into the bowels of slavery to free her parents. Aunt Harriet was probably one of the best known abolitionist figures. Harriet Tubman returned to the South 19 times and brought out scores of slaves to the North and to Canada by way of the Underground Railroad. The Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Vigilance Committee was comprised of 19 well-respected men who were passionate about the abolition of slavery. These men were the administrators of the Underground Railroad. They coordinated the sophisticated network and overall efforts of road agents, station masters, and conductors. Over a 10-year period, Harriet Tubman's courageous and valiant work was known to the Vigilance Committee. There were also women sympathizers, abolitionists, and suffragists who supported the work of the Vigilance Committee and also the work of Harriet Tubman. Most notable were Lucretia Mott, founder of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, and Eliza Wigham of Scotland, secretary of the Anti-Slavery Society of Edinburgh. Wigham was known to send monies specifically to support the efforts of Harriet Tubman. During Harriet's Underground Railroad years, many of her supporters funded her rescues and allowed her to use their properties to harbor fugitives. So this created a well-established network of reliable safe havens along her route. Thomas Garrett, a Quaker and trusted friend, assisted Harriet with many of her rescue missions. He provided money, food, clothing, and housing for the refugees. Most of the vigilance committees and anti-slavery societies, though, remained in existence once the President of the United States, then President Abraham Lincoln, decried the Emancipation Proclamation. Many of them closed. Harriet Tubman was committed to resistance, liberation, and activism. Harriet was passionate about service to others. She served her God, she served her family, she served her people, and she served her country during the Civil War. Aunt Harriet was enlisted to work in the Union Army during the Civil War as a spy, scout, and nurse. She was the first woman to lead an armed assault. Using her knowledge of the area, she led 3 steamboat attacks on Confederate plantations along the Combahee River. Guess what? 700 more slaves were freed, many of whom became Union soldiers. During her 4 years in the war, she did not receive pay. It is said that she only took 20 days of rations. Harriet herself described how she made fruit pies, gingerbread, and root beer, which was sold to the soldiers for her to support herself. The Union Army also found her to be extremely valuable as a nurse. She spent much of her time tending to soldiers who were stricken with dysentery, smallpox, and fevers. She developed quite a reputation for preparing medicine from the roots of plants found near the waterways. This was a skill that she learned from her parents. Undoubtedly, Harriet Tubman was a woman of courage, zeal, integrity, and fidelity. Her life was dedicated to the freedom and safety of her people. A couple of years after she returned home from the Civil War, Harriet Tubman requested a pension for her service in the Union Army during that war. In 1868, William H. Seward from Auburn, New York, former Secretary of State under Lincoln, presented a petition to Congress for Harriet Tubman to receive a pension for her services rendered during the war. Harriet was not successful in getting the pension from the United States government, which would have acknowledged her for her demonstrated and awesome abilities as a scout, spy, and nurse. Efforts to get a pension for her were sneered at by the congressman. No matter how distinguished the man or how many men signed the petition, it was thought to be absurd. Her pension was denied. So by 1869, Aunt Harriet was desperately in need of money. Sarah Bradford, a friend and contemporary writer, published a book about Harriet's bravery, persistence, and self-sacrifice. The proceeds were donated to her. 2 letters contained in that account of Harriet's life were particularly striking. No one knew Aunt Harriet and her work as well as Frederick Douglass, friend, abolitionist, humanitarian, and orator. His letter sums up her essence. Douglass wrote, "Dear Harriet, I am glad to know that the story of your eventful life has been written by a kind lady and that same is soon to be published. You ask for what you do not need when you call upon me for a word of commendation. I need such words from you far more than you can need them from me, especially where your superior labors and devotion to the cause of the lately enslaved of our land are known as I know them. The difference between us is marked. Most of what I have done and suffered in the service of our cause has been in public, and I have received much encouragement at every step of the way. You, on the other hand, have labored in a private way. What you have done has been witnessed by a few trembling, scarred, and footsore bondsmen and women who you have led out of the house of bondage, and whose heartfelt "God bless you" has been your only reward. I know of no one who has willingly encountered more perils and hardships to serve our enslaved people than you have. Much that you have done would seem improbable to those who do not know you as I know you. It is my pleasure and great privilege to bear testimony for your character and your works, and to say to those to whom you may come that I regard you in every way truthful and trustworthy. This is who she was. She was simply Aunt Harriet. Also, the fiery and fierce abolitionist Wendell Phillips wrote, "The last time I ever saw John Brown was under my own roof, as he brought Harriet Tubman to me, saying, 'Mr. Phillips, I bring you one of the best and bravest persons on the continent, General Tubman, as we call her.'" Brown went on to recount her labors and sacrifices on behalf of her race. After that, Harriet spent some time in Boston, earning the confidence and admiration of all of those who were working for freedom. With their aid, she went south more than once, returning always with a squad of self-emancipated men, women, and children for whom her marvelous skills had opened the way of escape. After the war broke out, she was sent with endorsements from Governor John Andrew and his friends to South Carolina, where in the service of our nation she rendered important and efficient aid to our army. In my opinion, there were few captains, perhaps few colonels, who have done more for the loyal cause since the war began, and few men who before that time did more for the colored race than our fearless and sagacious friend Harriet. Aunt Harriet's valiant war record was enviable. Even by today's standards, she would have been decorated for her outstanding service and achievements. This is who she was. She was simply Aunt Harriet. After the war, Aunt Harriet lived the last 50 years of her life in Auburn, New York. Over those years, she acquired 32 acres of land. 180 South Street Road is where the Harriet Tubman homestead was located. It was a 2-story brick house where she lived with her second husband, Nelson Davis, who served in the United States Colored Infantry during the Civil War. Her parents, Rit and Ben, resided there too. From time to time, she opened her home to other family members and boarders who needed a place to stay. Life was good at 180 South Street Road. In season, her property was bountiful with apple, peach, and pear trees. She lovingly tended to her vegetable garden, and she could be seen walking as far south as Scipio, selling her fruits and vegetables from her garden. You know, Harriet often thought about her freedom-fighting work, but she was also acutely aware of the women's right to vote movement. She was aware that, historically, the anti-slavery movement and the women's right to vote movement were great forces happening at the same time. From 1833 to 1920, the rights of African Americans and the rights of women took center stage in politics. During that time, many abolitionists were also suffragists. Both movements were central to moral, religious, political activities and discourse. As a result, race, gender, culture, supremacy, and sexism intersected in ways that made both movements struggle for generations to fully achieve their objectives and goals. And when we dig a little deeper, we find that the women's rights movement was really not so diverse or inclusive. We now know that the mainstream women's movement was comprised primarily of white women who did not want to risk the viability of the movement by outreaching to African American women. So women like Aunt Harriet, Sojourner Truth, Maria Stewart, Harriet Fortin Purvis, Nanny Burroughs, Mary Church Terrell, Mary Ann Chad Carey, Frances Watkins Harper, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Helen Apple Cook, Margaret Murray Washington, and Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin were African American abolitionists and suffragists who advocated for the equal right to vote. They were women who were equally committed to suffrage. So between working and managing their home lives, African American women found the time to advocate to abolish slavery, to gain citizenship for African Americans, and to gain the right to vote for African American men and African American women. And Harriet believed in the equality of all people, black or white, male or female. She was not a leader in the mainstream women's rights movement, but she was a strong supporter. It is said that she had relationships with abolitionists and suffragists, like Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, Emily Howland, Frances Seward, Lizette Warden, and Eliza Wright Osborne. Yet, Aunt Harriet knew the realities of the times. African American women had to organize separately. She understood this so much so that in 1896, at the age of 75, she was one of the founders of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs in Washington, D.C. The National Association of Colored Women's Clubs was a coalition of African American women who were dedicated to uplifting women, children, families, the home, and community through service and community education. They also provided scholarship so African Americans were better able to take their proper place in society as citizens, voters, community leaders, parents, and family members. Aunt Harriet, along with Ida B. Wells, Margaret Murray Washington, Frances E.W. Harper, and Mary Church Terrell, founded the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs with the vision, lifting as we climb, we knock at the bar of justice for an equal chance. Today, the National Association of Colored Women continues the work and promotes the legacy of Aunt Harriet and its founders. I believe Aunt Harriet's last show of activism was the founding of the John Brown Home for the Indigent and Aged Colored People. She named the home after her very good friend John Brown, for whom she had a great fondness. They were kindred spirits in the fight for freedom. She revered him. He was a white man that gave his life for the cause. He was hung for treason for his role in the raid at Harper's Ferry. At the age of 87, she established the home to carry on her work after she was gone of caring for the old and the poor in the community. The facility operated from 1908 until the early 1920s. John Brown Hall, as it was commonly called, was used as an infirmary and dormitory. Aunt Harriet prayed that she would see her dream come true, and she did. Aunt Harriet was a patient there herself about a year before she died. In her honor, the John Brown Hall was renamed Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged. The Harriet Tubman property is now managed in partnership with the National Park Service and the Harriet Tubman Home Incorporated. Aunt Harriet's passion and activism coursed a lifetime, and her imprint certainly went well beyond the Underground Railroad. So one wonders whether Aunt Harriet attained the freedom that she dreamed of and hoped for. You know, it's quite amazing what hope does for the human spirit. Beyond all obstacles, tragedies, hard work, and hurt, Aunt Harriet still hoped for, lived for, and strived for all which we all want: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Hope allows for imagining and visioning a future of freedom, human equality, human rights, civil rights, dignity, and respect for every American. If we take a page out of Aunt Harriet's playbook, she would encourage each of us to take action when we see injustice. She would say, "Don't talk to me about it, do something about it." If she were here today, she would say, "Use your hard-won right to vote. Take your voice to the ballot box." You know, one of my mother's fondest memories is of her father on voting day. His name was Clarence Morgan Stokes, and he was born in 1886 in Aurora, New York. He was a proud Lincoln Republican. On voting day, Granddad would put on his best suit, secure his spats, and put on his favorite hat. And in his dignified manner, he was ready to walk to the polling place. He took his right to cast his vote very seriously. Aunt Harriet knew Clarence. Everybody called him Bobby. As a teenager, Bobby drove Aunt Harriet by horse and buggy to do her errands and to visit neighbors in the community. After Aunt Harriet's death, what she did not know was that Bobby would become the husband of her great-grandniece, Elida Gaskin, and become the father of Joyce Stokes Jones, co-author of Beyond the Underground, Aunt Harriet, Moses of her people. Harriet Tubman died in Auburn, New York on March 10, 1913, at 92 years of age. She was buried with military honors at Fort Hill Cemetery. We will always remember Aunt Harriet for her compassion, courage, bravery, service to others, and her commitment to faith, family, fortitude, and freedom. In the spirit of Harriet Tubman and her dedication to liberation, resistance, and activism, we should be inspired to transform our communities and society into places where freedom, equality, human rights, and civil rights are upheld for every American. And there you have it. Aunt Harriet leaves us a legacy of resistance, liberation, activism, and hope. Thanks to each of you for sharing time with me today. Thanks.